Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail today. We are going to share camping encounter horror stories. First story. Don't go camping alone, ever. I ain't scared of nothing. That's what I yelled to my brother as I slammed the door to my car shut. Things have, changed since then. I've changed. I remember his smirk, how he held out my jacket, the way he spouted off an endless list of things I should be scared of. Skinwalkers and witches and werewolves, oh my. He presented each one as reason after reason of why this idea was stupid, saying I still had time to flake out, save face. I remember rolling my eyes, snatching my jacket from his grasp, sliding into my car and yelling that I'm not scared before speeding away towards the darkening outline of the mountains. They stood out stark against the setting sun like teeth. Boy, how I wish I listened. I was wrong. He was right. I'm fucking scared. Let me back up a bit. It all started about 2 days ago. I was out of my mind depressed. Could barely get out of bed. Thought about chucking myself in front of cars, over bridges, off buildings, just dying. I thought about dying all the time. And enough was enough. One of the few friends I had suggested that I try solo camping said it might clear my mind, that the wilderness, the silence, the solitude would do me good. He gave me a list of spots, some more isolated than the others. I decided on the most isolated one, which was about a 3-hour hike from the last campsite far out in the Rocky Mountain National Forest. I remember his face, the surprise, the acceptance. You sure? His voice cracked. I nodded, saying nothing. Okay, I mean it's a pretty secluded place, especially for a first-time camper. He shrugged. But, then again, it's a beautiful spot. It'll definitely give you some perspective. And the night sky out there is insane. I thanked him and turned to leave, but he spoke up again. Hey, don't let the forest spook you, okay? A word of advice from a veteran. Don't go out at night no matter what you hear. You might get totally fucked by a bear or lion. The drive up the mountains was strangely soothing. The gently curving roads that wove their way through the trees and up the rocks were exciting to navigate, and soon my mind was eased into a peaceful contemplation. I had decided to forego electronics this trip, even going as far as securing my phone in my glove box. I wanted to be completely free of all that shit, able to focus on the now rather than ruminate about the past or fear the future. I would be gone for 5 days and 4 nights, enough time for me to, hopefully, recuperate and reassess my life and what I was doing with it. I soon descended into Estes Park and drove through the picturesque town towards RMNP, willing myself not to stay at the Stanley instead. I found the entrance to the park with ease and continued to the closest lot to my campsite. Night was now falling, and I silently cursed myself for leaving so late. I sat in my car for a good 30 minutes before deciding that it would be too risky hiking 3 hours in near pitch black. There were 4 other tents set up in the lot I was at with room for one more, and soon I had my own tent set up. That night passed comfortably. I was surrounded by chatting, laughing people and unruly, but happy children who ran round and round screaming. A few of them offered me roasted hot dogs and s'mores and beers, and I filled my belly, smiling. I was rolled up in my sleeping bag before the last light from the dying embers faded away. The second night didn't go so smoothly. I woke up late, well-rested, but still groggy, and took my time repacking my tent. I hesitated at first, wondering if I should just stay there, but at 3 p.m. another family showed up with proof they had reserved the site. So, I gathered my things and set off, and immediately got lost. Navigating by map and compass for the first time and alone is a lot harder than it sounds. And the trees. The trees can be misleading, can turn you around, make you think you're on the right path when really you're miles from where you're supposed to be. Instead of taking me 3 hours to get to the site, it took me nearly twice that time, and I was swiftly losing what little light was left in the day. Finally I found the site. But before I breathed a sigh of relief, I haphazardly set up my tent, building a small fire in front. It was dark now and I was jumpy. Every sound I heard was seemingly magnified. Every shadow cast by the dim light of the fire, a menace. Spooked, I crawled into the tent and curled up in my bag, trying to will myself into sleep. After a while, I was dozing, about to drift off, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a foot crunching outside. My eyes shot open and I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I waited. I heard the sound again. Someone or something was definitely walking around my tent. It sounded like whatever they was trying to be quiet, stealthy. That went on for hours in inconsistent bursts until I finally decided it was an animal, scavenging for the scraps or inspecting my tent. By dawn I was dozing again and the noise had finally stopped. I told myself I would sleep for an hour or two, giving myself time to rest up. I woke up disoriented, exhausted, and started to panic before remembering I was out camping and that I needed to start hiking back. Now, but when I exited the tent, I saw that the sun was already setting. To say I was upset would be an understatement. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home. I wanted to leave, see how far I could get out there. But deep down I knew I'd instantly get lost and probably end up in a worse situation. So, I began collecting as much wood as I could to build a big-ass fire and prepared to hunker down for the night. The light from the sun seemed to disappear unfathomably fast. The third night was, pretty problematic. I sat awake in my tent for hours after the sun went down, waiting. I'd left the fire going for as long as the wood lasted. I know this isn't kosher for camping, but I was improvising and I was absolutely terrified. The darkness around me seemed to crush the light from the fire, making it seem small, pathetic, a tiny candle in a sea of shadows. For hours I sat there, listening, afraid. Finally, I realized I was just being ridiculous, that what I had heard the night before was nothing to fear, that my subconscious, my monkey mind, was just playing tricks on me, keeping me alert for no reason. So I bundled myself up and laid down. And I heard it, softly at first. A footstep, then two, three, growing louder, bolder. I sat up and felt my eyes increase to the size of saucers and my breath quickened. What was that? I had to know. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't. I was operating purely off of fear. I heard the noise. It sounded like something running around and around my tent. Suddenly, the side of my tent pushed in as if someone was slapping it from the outside. "Hey!" I yelled, scared out of my wits. "Hey! I'm awake. I'm in here." I tried to stand, tripping myself up in my sleeping bag in the process, and slammed into the front of the tent. Scrambling up, I swiftly unzipped the flap and ran outside with a red-tinted flashlight. I saw a shape scurry away and followed. And there, standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They were standing with their back towards me. Their arms were hanging in strange positions by their sides, their head pointed straight away from me. I took a step towards them and a branch cracked underneath me. The sound seemed to startle the person, and they turned their head ever so slightly. "Hey!" I said again. "What the fuck, man?" And it boiled up, a sound that crescendoed into a scream. It was laughter, and it echoed around me, rattling around in my skull. I ran, leaping into my tent, zipping it up behind me, curling into my sleeping back, crying. And the world around me exploded, or rather imploded. The walls of the tent shook, like hundreds of hands were slapping it, poking it, punching it. Outside, what sounded like dozens of people running around shattered the silence. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I think I fainted. Either way, I woke up the next day to a reddish glow encompassing my surroundings. I sat up and ran outside, looking around for proof of what I had heard. But there was nothing. No footprints, handprints, or any disturbance at all. "Fuck this," I muttered to myself, throwing my things chaotically into my bag. I would leave today in the dark. I couldn't stay another night here. I was just starting to unpole the tent when I heard it, a sound in the distance, perhaps carried to me by the wind which was picking up around me. "Help me! Help me! Please, oh God! Oh God! Help me!" I reacted more out of instinct than logic and began running towards the sound before realizing that I, in no way, was in a place to help whoever was screaming. Still, I tried to locate the source of the sound, following the voice for about 30 minutes. "Where are you?" I yelled, looking around me through the maze of trees. "I'm here. Where are you?" Quickly, the screams descended into a deep, unsettling laughter. Scared out of my mind, I turned and ran back the way I came. By some miracle, I made it back to my site, grabbed my pack, and uprooted the poles of the tent, thinking that I would just roll it up and carry it back instead of taking the time to fold it neatly and shove it into its bag. Around me, the mountains loomed up like fangs, like I was about to be swallowed whole by a monstrous mouth. As I pulled each pole, the tent fell a little, but it was only on the third pole of out 6 that I realized it wasn't falling fully flat. Confused, I peered into the tent and reeled in horror, too afraid to even scream. There was someone sitting inside, but not just anyone. It was me, sitting there, pallor and bone-thin, a too-wide grin plastered on my face. A single droplet of blood rolled down from each eye which, instead of having green irises, were totally, wholly black. I jumped back, tripping over my own feet. Laughter rose up around me, and as I scrambled up I saw my hand that was not my hand reach out from the tent, followed swiftly by the other, then the head. My face that was not my face looked up at me, still smiling, then laughed again. I screamed. I stood. I ran. And I ran. I didn't even know if I was running the right way. I couldn't even use the sun anymore for guidance since it had almost fully set. I ran without looking where I was going. I kept looking behind me to see if that thing was following me. I could feel the trees scratching me up, pushing against me, like they were trying to hold me back, hold me still until that thing came for me. Suddenly a light flashed in my face, and I ran into something solid, something black, something that wrapped around me. I instantly cowered, hiding my face in my hands. Shit. Oh please God, no, 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 no. I heard my own voice, terrified, shaking. Hey, calm down. It's okay. You just scared me. Calm down, what's wrong? I looked up and into the worried gray eyes of a human face. The face of a middle-aged man, to be exact. He was holding me up. The flashlight he was using lay fallen at our feet, creating strange shadows behind us. I looked back, fearful of what I might see, but there was nothing, only trees swinging slowly in the slight breeze. Hey, he said again. Was that you? Screaming? I came out here to check. I couldn't speak. I was too terrified. I shook my head. Were you camping out there alone? He asked, letting me go and bending down to retrieve the flashlight. I nodded, then began crying. Hey, it's okay. It can be spooky out here. Come on. My car is right over there. He gestured with his head back behind him. I wiped my nose and blinked, finally finding my voice. Who are you? He glanced at me then away. I'm, a park ranger. But he didn't look like one. He was wearing a smooth black suit, black tie, and white shirt. And his shoes were polished leather, not hiking boots. Come on, he said again, taking my pack and swinging it onto his back. As he did so, his jacket flapped slightly and I saw what looked like a Sig Sauer handgun strapped to his belt. Okay, I said, looking back behind me again. How did you find me? He shrugged. Good hearing. We entered a small clearing and I saw a matte black SUV with tinted windows, headlights flaring, engine idling, parked in the middle of it. He popped the trunk and threw my bag in as I climbed into the passenger side seat. He climbed in the driver's seat and asked me where he should take me. I told him the lot number, and we were on our way. After a few moments, he flipped the cubby between us open and pulled out a bag. Corn nuts? He asked, holding out the bag to me. I took it gratefully and began chomping away. I licked my fingers, then looked back at him. So, are you really a ranger? He looked at me, then back to the road, but still I stared at him, transfixed. He looked exhausted, his wood-colored hair disheveled and dirty from the forest. The SUV jerked to a sudden stop and the man let out a slow, low breath. His eyes narrowed and he looked over at me, then back to the dirt trail in front of us. I followed his gaze, feeling the fear churning up inside me. And there, in the middle of the road, was me. The me that was not me. Its limbs hung limply, as if they were broken, and that sickly smile was still plastered across the face. It waved. The man looked back at me, then back at the thing that was not me, then back at me. I met his gaze. I don't get paid enough for this shit, the man muttered before slamming his foot on the accelerator straight towards the thing. We both felt the impact. The car bounced over the body and the man kept driving. But around us, in between the trees, stirred into the darkness, laughter boiled up, manic and persistent. We reached the lot in silence, bathed in the first light of the rising sun. The man beside me seemed to be deep in thought, distracted. I was still scared, but hopeful that whatever that thing was, it was now dead, crushed by the car. Or at least so badly wounded that it would soon succumb. The SUV slowed to a stop and the man popped the trunk and hopped out. He walked to the back and grabbed my pack as I jumped out. He handed to me and I took it, then thanked him for everything. "No problem," he said, "all in a day's or night's work." His lips quivered as if he was about to smile. I turned to leave, but he spoke up again. "Hey." I turned to face him again. "If you ever want to talk about what you, saw, or, just talk, call me." He held out a card. I took it and looked down at it. It was matte black and only had a single number written on it. There was no area code. Then I began, but I heard a door slam and looked up. The man was already back in his car. He waved at me, then sped off back the way we had come, back towards that thing. I shoved the card in my pocket, climbed into my car, and left, breathing a sigh of relief. I still haven't told anyone about what happened, even when they asked why I refused to go camping ever again. I just shrug and tell them it wasn't my thing, that I prefer a warm bed and the bustling sounds of a busy city. Every so often, though, I'll pull out the card, my fingers lingering over my phone, wondering if I should call, wondering who the man really was, and if he'd really be able to explain what happened to me. Second story. How to survive camping. More idiocy from the locals. I run a private campground. Let me make something clear here. The majority of people that I meet are decent, sensible folks. They don't follow the lights, they don't leave petty one-star reviews on Google, and they don't murder people unnecessarily. But that's boring to talk about, isn't it? That's why you get to hear about the spectacularly stupid things people do. And to continue that trend, let's talk about the locals today. It's a good thing my town is isolated and probably thinks Reddit is slang for some new street drug the city kids are doing in their coffee shops and boutique bookstores. Because as the title alludes, we're going to talk about more of the dumb shit they've gotten up to over the years. If you're new here, you should start at the beginning, and if you're totally lost, this might help. Let's talk about rule number 13 again. It used to be rule number 15, but then I deleted a few, so it's number 13 now. I'm sure that won't confuse anyone. Rule number 13. Don't eat food you find sitting out around the campsite. It's not yours, and worse, it might be an offering, and you will offend whatever it is intended for. I told you earlier about how this rule covers a lot of different things. Eating food that isn't yours is an invitation for terrible things to happen to you in so many ways. Sometimes it's bait, sometimes it's a test, and worst of all, sometimes it's an offering. Because if it's an offering, that means you just pissed off an ancient thing. Which is certainly exciting, but it's also not very complicated. Doesn't make for a good story. Someone eats an offering, the deity it belonged to smites the person out of existence. Now, it's not like people go around leaving offerings everywhere on my land. Some people do, but sometimes whatever ancient being is passing through leaves them out themselves. A test, perhaps, or a trap. I suppose a living offering is far more satisfying than a pile of gold or a handful or wheat or whatever they already have. Or maybe they just get forgetful and are like, "Oh hey, didn't I have an offering? Where did I leave that lying around?" We've all done that, right? Put something important in a safe location and thereby doom yourself to never find it again? That was my tax documents this year. It's fine. I eventually found them after I turned the house upside down. You may also be wondering, how often do we get deities coming through? Not often, as far as I'm aware. Probably about as frequently as everyone else. Yes, even you have likely lived somewhere that a deity passed through. These ancient things roam the world as they please. After all, there is a way to bring an ancient being around, however. I wouldn't call it summoning, for these creatures cannot be compelled to do anything they do not care to do. It's more like enticement. Like how we leave out stockings and an offering of food on Christmas Eve, and St. Nicholas, being the good saint that he is, obliges to stop by. Not all saints are kind, and not all ancient things are saints. I remember the night a goddess came to our town. My mother stood outside at the tail end of sunset, risking the appearance of the little girl with her tardiness. My father wouldn't let me go to her, and he called for her to come inside. She did, reluctantly. There was fire on the horizon, she said. I peered out the window, but all I saw was the sunset. Certainly, the sun blazed red and stained the sky with its own radiant fire, but I didn't understand why this made her so grim, or why Dad looked so worried. In time you develop a sense for these things, when the world is out of sorts. For a long time I've thought it was just experience, the sorts of things you learn from your parents or from seeing them firsthand. Matthias's journal makes me wonder if there's more to it. Perhaps human intuition can be tuned to pick up these vibrations that the inhuman world makes. But once spoke of a web. Has it been over a year now? One I was blind to. I wonder if someday I will feel it tremble and know what it means. A few days later my parents received a social visit from someone in town. Well, it started as a social visit. A couple dropped by unexpectedly, and they brought with them a pecan pie and one of their children. I was sent to my room with the girl, who was a few years younger than me, to keep her entertained. We mostly picked on each other, for we went to the same school and she knew me by reputation, until I grew tired of it and we snuck into the living room to play video games while our parents were in the kitchen. I wasn't entirely focused on the game as I'd played it before, and wasn't terribly interested in walking someone I was forced to entertain through the controls. I half listened to the conversation instead. There was something strange going on at their farm, they said. Something was coming around the barn at night. Did it start a few days ago? My mother asked. The pair latched onto that. Yes, it had, the man replied eagerly. Did they know what it was? I have a few ideas, Mom replied. I don't think it'll be a problem for you, though. It should pass on by. It's bothering the children, though, the woman said. They can't sleep. They're afraid. Could you just stop by and take a look? I'm sure if we told them that the campground people investigated and say it's safe, they'd calm right down. I felt pretty smug at overhearing that. The girl next to me was intently focused on the game, but I couldn't help but smirk. Scaredy cat. I had to listen to a little girl crying outside my window all night and a beast that dragged her away at dawn, and I wasn't afraid. I think I was afraid back then. I just didn't know how to admit it to myself at the time. I guess we can, if we find time, my mother said reluctantly. It's spring. There's a lot to do around the campground. My father hastily added, trying to cover for my mother's disinterest. He always was more concerned about our reputation around town. We know it's a burden, but we'd truly appreciate it, the man said. It'd probably go a long way towards making folks around here realize you're helpful for more than just killing monsters, too. And there was the bait. My father seized on it, as they likely knew he would. He was desperate to repair the legacy his own father left behind. Our guests finished their slices of pie and began the process of leaving. Then the man called to the girl, sharply, saying nothing more than her name. She dropped the controller with a gasp, as if she'd been shocked. Her face was pale. They're going to kill me, she whispered. She wasn't speaking to me. I had no idea what to say, and nor was I given the chance to reply, for she hurriedly scrambled to her feet and followed them to the door. She kept her head down the entire time and didn't say goodbye until her mother prodded her to. I assumed at the time that she was going to be in trouble for playing video games. Some parents were like that. Technically, the rule was my brother, and I weren't allowed to play on school nights, but I figured I'd get away with it since we had a guest. I did. The next day, I returned home from school to find my mother getting ready to go out. Dad had prevailed on her. She'd stop by their house this afternoon and take a look around. She was snapping at my dad, irritated at being roped into this chore. We know what it is, she shouted at him from the bedroom. Their kids just need to toughen up a little. Honey, not everyone is like you. We don't all chase off a devil in high school. Yeah, and it shows. I pretended they weren't arguing and started laying out my homework on the kitchen table. Sadly, I was not going to be left out of it this time. My mom came into the kitchen like a tornado, focused, direct, and pulling everything around her into her wake. Let's go, Kate, she said coolly. You're coming with me. I have homework, Dash. I just didn't want to be forced to interact with kids that didn't like me. This won't take long. I just need you to show them there's nothing to be scared of. Now that appealed to my base nature. A chance to show off that I was better than everyone else? I was in. I don't recall exactly how old I was, but I was at least in middle school. I think that's the age that most kids turn into insufferable shits, right? The owners eagerly came to greet us when we arrived. Their farmhouse was of stereotypical build with blue siding and white trim. There were many like it in the area. 2 stories with a wraparound porch, each painted in vivid colors. For children were lined up on the porch, leaning on the railing. Farming was difficult around here. The land was broken up by hills and forests. There wasn't much flat, consecutive land to make fields out of. Our farmers could scrape by a living, but they weren't exactly thriving either. I guess they kept with it out of a sense of tradition, like how we passed the campground from generation to generation. Some of these farms may even be old land. "We're so glad you came," the woman said, clutching my mother's hand. Mom was uncomfortable with her hand being held by this person. She awkwardly extricated it. She wasn't as social as my father, nor was she as diplomatic. But something about this situation made her uneasy. It felt off. She asked me later if I had felt it as well. I told her I'd been paying more attention to the children on the porch, for I recognized some of them from school and didn't like how they were staring at me like a line of crows. "You said something was wrong with the barn?" my mom asked. "Yes, something comes there after dark. We find claw marks on the inside walls." "Claw marks? On the inside?" They assured her that was what was happening. Then the woman asked if my mother wanted to sit down for some coffee first and hear the full story. Mom dismissed the invitation. Likely she could figure it out from the claw marks alone, she said. The truth was she didn't want to be trapped here playing niceties. That was something my dad was good at, not her. Besides, I had homework I needed to do. That was her backup excuse. On the way to the barn, Mom whispered to me to stick close to her. That was my first indication that something was going wrong. This wasn't just take a look around and then leave. Mom's bored confidence had been replaced with a wary unease. She kept her gaze up, looking about her for signs that anything was amiss. Goddesses don't leave claw marks. At least, not the kind of goddess Mom thought came to town. Ahead of us, the pair rolled back the barn doors and stood there at the entrance, waiting for us to enter. Mom stopped at the doorway, not yet stepping through. "Kind of dark in here," she complained, and she refused to go further. After an awkward moment of standing around with no one speaking, the man reluctantly went inside to get a lantern. Only once he was inside did she follow him. The woman remained by the door. I hesitated. I didn't want to go into this barn. I'd caught on to my mother's wariness, and I feared whatever was inside. For all my mother's comments about my bravery, I was afraid. I wonder if my mother was too. I've never stopped being afraid. I've just learned how to drown it with anger. My mother called to me, softly. Reluctantly, I hurried to her side. I wanted to take her hand, but I twisted them together in front of me instead, not wanting to show that I was scared, not even to her. She brought me here to be an example, I told myself. I glanced furtively around the dark barn. Stacks of hay obscured the walls. How would they even know there were claw marks? "Here you are," the man said. He handed the lantern to my mother without turning it on, and as she ran her hands over its base, searching for the switch, he attacked her. My mother was expecting this. Rather, she was expecting something. So when he tried to grab her by the neck, she smashed the lantern in his face. It didn't break, but he reeled anyway, and she kicked him in the knee. He went down hard. Then the woman grabbed me by my hair. She dragged me backwards, yelling at my mother to not move an inch. I glanced up and saw that in her other hand, she had a gun, and it was pointed at my mom. I didn't struggle, terrified that the slightest movement would provoke her into firing. I wasn't scared of monsters or gods, but I was terrified of losing my mother. It's a fear I never grew out of. I was afraid up until the day she died, and losing her was even more painful than I imagined it would be. "There's no claw marks in here," my mother said evenly. She continued to walk forwards, towards the woman, who frantically yelled at her to stay back. "Shooting me won't work, will it? I know what kind of goddess came into town a few days ago. A goddess of the harvest, right? Blood has to be spilled in just the right way for it to be an offering. She won't bless your fields otherwise, will she?" Behind my mother, the man was struggling to stand, heavily favoring his good knee. I refrained from crying out to my mom, but she caught my gaze and I knew that she understood. Only a few more moments before she had to fight him off again. "Then I'll shoot you and sacrifice the kid," the woman snarled. "Kate can take care of herself." There it was, the signal that it was time to handle this myself. My mother whirled. just in time to catch the man in the gut with a well-aimed fist. And I, small but strong from all that time spent chopping wood, grabbed the woman's arm and forced it sideways. The gunshot went wild, hitting the barn wall instead and punching through, letting in a small beam of sunlight. I hung onto her wrist as she attempted to shake me off, keeping her from steadying her aim. Then a few seconds later my mother was there, having downed the man again with a few more blows to the face. My mother ripped the gun out of her hands, turned it around, and shot her. For a moment we just stood there, panting. Then Mom pulled the clip out of the gun and pocketed it. "I'm sorry, Kate," she said. "I didn't think they'd do something this stupid." "I'm okay," I whispered. "I know. I wish you didn't have to see the evil of mankind, though. Monsters are bad enough." She walked towards the man, who was still on the ground, groaning as he stirred out of his daze. Mom had about knocked him unconscious. She crouched by where he lay. "Mom, their kid said something at our house," I said, startled by my own voice. I didn't know if this was the right time to bring this up, but it was like the words were spilling out of me now, and I couldn't take them back. "She said they'd kill her." "That was your youngest, wasn't it?" my mom asked the man. She grabbed his collar and pulled him up. With her other hand, she pulled out her pocket knife and flipped it open. "What would you have tried if we hadn't come out here?" my mom demanded. The farmer didn't answer. He stared stoically at the barn wall. I thought of the row of children lined up on the front porch. My mother was thinking of them as well, for her expression hardened. "Yeah, I thought so," she said, and she slit his throat. We rolled the barn doors shut behind us. No doubt the children would know what happened, as Mom's hands were covered in blood, but there was no need for them to see the bodies of their parents in person. Things would be bad enough for them from here out. Mom seemed tired as we walked away. Her shoulders slumped and her steps were slow. As we approached the house, we found that only one of the children was still outside. The rest had been herded inside, and now only the eldest, a young man, stood at the front porch. Mom walked up to him but didn't climb the steps. He stared down at her, and for a moment, the two of them just looked like they would sink to the earth and never rise again. I think I understand that exhaustion. The weight of other people's choices can grind you down into dust if you let it. "Can you take care of them?" Mom asked, jerking her head towards the house. "Sure," he replied awkwardly. "They'd said I'm in the will as the guardian, in case anything were to ever happen." "How old are you?" 17. "Good enough. I'm sorry." He began to cry and quickly turned his head away. "Yeah," he choked out. "Me too." Mom seemed about to say something else, but out in the field, the barn burst into flames. It wasn't an explosion. It was just on fire in an instant. Like lighting a match, only the entire structure was the match head. The flames coated the walls and the roof, shining like the setting sun. Within minutes, the ceiling collapsed, belching a gust of debris and smoke. The walls were quick to tumble inwards, and the flames narrowed, spiraling like a tornado. There would be no bodies left for the children to see, much less bury. "It seems the goddess has accepted our sacrifice," my mother said in an odd voice. Mom took my hand, and we walked back to the car. I didn't consciously keep track of what happened to that family afterwards, but I heard snippets from my parents over dinner now and again. The farm prospered that year, and the year after, and perhaps even longer. No one else had to die for it. The goddess's blessing extended through the years, perhaps pitying the children. These ancient things are cruel to the wicked with one hand and good to the righteous with the other. Perhaps it was even a saint that came through, or a saint that was once a goddess. Or maybe it was just another ancient thing unknown to us, remnants of some stories told long ago, over and over again, until eventually they were forgotten. I don't know. And the only people that might have told us, the ones that brought it here with the promise of a sacrifice, are long dead. That's just how it goes, sometimes. I'm a campground manager. I sometimes think about my mother, about how angry she was during that drive back to the campground. She knew why they targeted us. Enough bad blood around here that they might have gotten away with it. We're expendable, after all. Let the campground people take care of the monsters. Let them die instead of us. There's anger, and then there's hatred. I think my mother hated them for what they'd done. Not just because they tried to kill her, or because they would have killed their daughter, but because they'd shown me a cruel truth of the world before she thought I was ready. People can be more evil than the monsters. They don't even need to be corrupted by the inhuman, like a bargain with an ancient thing or an inherited power can do. They can accomplish evil just fine on their own. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it. It's hard to stay naive. Anyway, I'll wrap it up here. I got a new four-wheeler today, courtesy of you/Whitmo, and I'm dying to ride it around for a bit. Gotta enjoy it while it lasts. After all, RIP Tint instead. Read the full list of rules. Visit the campground's website. Third story. The last camping trip. It was just supposed to be a typical camping trip with my scout troop. My friends and I were so excited. Davey, Kevin, and I. We always looked forward to these camping trips, and the yearly autumn camp out was one of the best. We took a bus to Grayson Falls, a huge state park with so many lakes to swim in, trails to hike, and several caves to explore. All the local scout troops would be there, 10 in all, and we would meet in the Starfall campground for the jamboree. There would be canoeing and races and s'mores, and of course, the annual Scary Story contest. We had been crafting our stories since the last jamboree, and this year, we were ready to take that prize. As the bus pulled up to the campsite, we all spilled out of it excitedly. We were the first to arrive, the others getting there tomorrow, but Scoutmaster Larry had wanted us to get there early to get the best spots. As I stood in the center of the campground, watching the other scouts mill about, going about their preparations, I couldn't help but soak in the sounds and smells of the surrounding forest. Grayson State Park had always been my favorite place to camp, and it was chiefly because it exuded this energy of safety and adventure. It was a maintained park, the park rangers keeping the animals in check, and the forest peeled back from the areas where hikers and campers stayed. Even so, it wasn't too hard to imagine a wolf or a bear watching from the trees, just waiting to pounce on the unexpected. It wasn't too far-fetched to think that something mysterious or unknown could be lurking in those woods. We set up our tent a little further back than the others. Scoutmaster Larry had given us a set area where we could pitch our tents, and we had set our own tents at the edge of this. We wanted to feel like real scouts, like trailblazers, and I imagined us like old-timey explorers as Kevin and I set up our tents. Davey had disappeared, and I assumed he was getting water or firewood or something. No sooner had I set up my tent, though, than Davey hissed at us from the woods. "Nice campsite, but follow me if you girls want to do some real camping," he said, motioning us into the woods. "But," Kevin started, Scoutmaster Larry said. "Who cares what Scoutmaster Larry said? Do you want to camp, or what?" We looked at each other. I did feel pulled by adventure, and Kevin, despite being kind of a wet blanket, seemed to feel it too. We nodded, and Davey set out his plan. We would leave our tents here as a decoy, since they were already set up, and move off into the woods. Davey knew of a place where he had set up his tent where we could do some actual camping for the night, away from the adults and other scouts. It would be like camping on our own, being explorers and roughing it for real. "But what if they look for us?" Kevin asked. Davey just waves his hand at the question. "We'll go back to eat, and then after dinner, we'll head back to the site. We'll wake up before anyone gets good and stirring tomorrow, and be back in the camp before they notice anything." I had to admit, it wasn't a bad plan. We would strike the camp after tonight and rejoin the jamboree tomorrow as the others arrived. No one would miss us for just one night, not with so many other scouts around. Kevin and I agreed to go look at the campsite first, wanting to see where he had put it before we committed to staying the night. And so we plunged into the forest, Davey leading the way. We took no trail, our feet following new ground as he led us to the campsite. As we went, I felt as though I could feel something watching us. It was still early afternoon and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature, but this tickling on the back of my neck felt a little sinister somehow. I turned to glance around as we went, but I saw nothing more dangerous than a blue jay or a squirrel. I decided I was being silly and caught up with Kevin and Davey as they headed for our secret campsite. Even Kevin had to admit that the campsite was pretty cool. It was set in a small clearing, and complete with a fire pit that led me to believe that other scouts had used this site before. His tent almost looked out of place here, and I could just imagine scouts before us sleeping under the stars in sleeping bags. Davey asked us what we thought, and I could see that both of us were sold on the idea of a rustic campout in the woods. We both agreed to come back after dinner, and thus we returned to the group. The rest of the day went by fairly uneventfully. We returned to find a hike about to begin, so we tagged along as Scoutmaster Larry showed us nature's glory. We were a little nervous that they might happen upon our campsite, but the hike took us around the nearby creek and up to a natural waterfall that fed from the lake nearby. As we returned, Scout Leader Mark had our dinner cooking over a small fire near the counselors' tents. We set about preparing for the meal, and soon we were all stretched out on the grass eating campfire stew and hardtack bread. As we ate, Scoutmaster Larry laid out the day's events for tomorrow's jamboree. It would be a whole day of canoe races, decathlons, contests, and all of it capped off by the scary story contest at the s'more roast. All of us were chattering quietly as we headed off to bed, the sun setting behind us, as the three of us pretended to head to our tents. As the sun set low, we moved into the woods and made our way to the campground. As we followed Davy into the woods, I began to hear something strange in the surrounding green. It started as an overriding noise, making Kevin and Davy hard to hear even at close proximity. Davy was too excited to even acknowledge it at first, but I saw Kevin shooting furtive looks into the surrounding wood. The sounds of the forest seemed to be higher than I had ever heard them, and the deeper we went, the louder it seemed to become. The birds sounded like a flock, squawking and chattering animatedly to each other, and many of them sounded like species not native to the region. The scouts are taught to identify local birds. It's for a badge, and many of these sounded different from the finches and quail you usually heard this time of year. I heard deer grunting and the yowls of cats, the growl of a bear, and even the throaty howl of a wolf. The strangest thing of all wasn't the sounds or the presence of non-native animals, though. The strangest part was that each cry was exactly the same. Same sound, same volume, same everything. The others could hear it too, that much was obvious, but they were pretending they couldn't. We could all hear the sounds of animals, all of them too loudly. Kevin was starting to cry. Davy kept insisting that once we made it to the campsite, everything would be okay. He was pulling Kevin along by now, Davy's hand wrapped around his wrist. Kevin was nearly frozen with fear, and I could see his eyes shining as he was half drugged through the trail. When we reached the tent, we all went straight in, not daring to even start the fire we had built up to use that night. We huddled in our tent, Kevin hyperventilating, as Davy and I peeked out through the flap. The forest was still very loud, very populated, but it seemed to stop at our campsite. It was like a song heard from behind a door. You know the song, but the words are muffled. We watched the woods, both of us agreeing that we couldn't go back. We would have to stay here tonight, and Davy said we should sleep in shifts. There's definitely something out there. If we sleep in shifts, we can catch it if it tries to sneak up on us. I agreed, but for the moment, the two of us just watched the woods. The noises were moving away, like a troupe of actors on the move, and Kevin came to join us as well. We spent an hour watching the woods, and I was unsurprised when I looked over to find Kevin snoring in a corner. The adrenaline was kicking out, and we were all getting tired. I told Davy I was going to lie down as well, but I just couldn't get comfortable. I was so tired, but my mind wouldn't shut off. I lay there, angrily tossing, for what felt like hours, and that was probably why I heard them. I had just started to doze when the first of the voices scraped across my senses. I woke up to find Davy and Kevin stirring, woken up by the voices from outside the tent. They were familiar voices, campers and scoutmasters we knew, all of them calling our names. They were out in the woods at night searching for us, and their voices clattered through the dark wilderness in a jarring way. They were too loud somehow, disturbing the perfect silence of the nighttime forest. They also seemed wrong somehow, like the animal sounds from earlier. Each of them was the exact same name, called in the exact same way, again and again. Davy opened the tent, looking out into the darkness, looking for flashlights. The forest was still dark, the crickets and the night birds alarmingly silent. The quiet of night was disturbed only by the yelling searchers, and the sound of their voices was making my skin crawl. Kevin seemed shaken as the voices grew closer and closer. Maybe we should just go to them, guys. They're going to be mad if they find our tent out here. We can just say we were out here using the bathroom. His voice shook as he said it, and I could tell he was getting ready to bolt. Kevin was the type who feared getting in trouble more than silly things like possible death. Davy turned away from the flap to look at him. Are you crazy? If we stay right where we are, they'll never find us. Kevin, however, didn't seem so sure. As we stood at the tent flap, watching the woods and listening to the voices, Kevin made a sound like a wounded cat and made a break for the woods. He shoved past us and went running into the brush, yelling that he was sorry for making them look for him. We heard him apologizing until his yells were suddenly cut off. He was stammering apologies 1 minute, and the next he was silent as he graved. Davy and I stood looking out into the woods, shuddering in the sudden silence that held sway across the dark green world. Then, as suddenly as they had stopped, the voices began again. We could hear Kevin's voice amongst them, calling for us to come out. "Davy," I said, both of us still looking out into the woods, my eyes having just realized something my brain should have a long time ago. "If they're out here looking for us, why don't they have flashlights?" Davy contemplated this, and it seemed to scare him just as much as it scared me. We went back inside, huddling in our tent as the voices grew closer and closer. Davy zipped up the doorway and walked backwards into the suddenly flimsy canvas tent. He seemed afraid to turn his back on the doorway and just sort of stood in the middle as he kept his eyes fixed to the secured opening. I hunkered in my sleeping bag, listening to the voices call our names as they came closer and closer. Davy shuddered, cocking his head like a dog who hears a noise. He suddenly took a step back towards the door, and I yelled at him to get away from there. I hunkered down in my own bag, hearing the voices calling our names, and my tears were wet as they slid nakedly down my face. We were trapped out here alone, with no one to help us. Why hadn't we just stayed with the others? I sunk deeper into my bag, hoping I would wake up to find out that this was just a dream and feel silly for letting it scare me. I opened my eyes as the zipper slid open. I looked out to find Davy standing in the doorway, looking out as the voices seemed to surround our tent. I begged him to close it, begged him to come back, but he only glanced back at me, almost apologetically. The moon cast his face in stark relief, turning him into a carved totem, and then he turned and stepped out into the night. He left the tent open, and I heard him scream as whatever was calling to us got him. His scream was high and long, cutting through the monotonous calling like an axe through a melon. It cut off at the peak of its terror, however, and the sound of its ending made me bunch down in my sleeping bag all the more. The next time I heard his voice was when it joined that frightening chorus, all of them now calling for me. I put my hands over my ears, trying to block them out. I wanted them to stop. I wanted this to all be over, and as I sat shuddering, I suddenly became aware that I couldn't hear anything. I pulled my hands away from my ears, slowly at first, and heard nothing but the silence of the outside night. I looked to the flap of the tent and found only the soft rustle of the fabric against the zipper as I began to worm out of the warm embrace of the sleeping bag. I got about half out, when suddenly they were all around me. Their hands pushed at the walls of the tent. Their faces were canvas-covered masks as they tried to press their way inside. I could see their terrible features and hear their ragged breathing as they all shoved at the thin barrier of my tent. There were so many of them, adults, children, animals, and others who resembled nothing so much as skeletons with vaguely human shapes. A shadow fell onto the floor of my dwelling, and I looked to see one framed in the open doorway. I zipped my sleeping bag shut then and hunkered at the bottom, a snail trapped inside its shell. Outside, I could hear the monotonous voices surrounding me again, moving in for the kill as I shuddered in the bottom of my sleeping bag. When I heard the metallic sound of a zipper, I knew I was done for. The creature sank its face into the mouth of the sleeping bag, and I cowered as its bony face leered at me. As it opened its mouth, it screamed my name, lunging at me with its bony teeth, its pale white skull luminescent in the darkness of the bag. I died with the sound of my own name fighting against the rippling scream that rode up my throat. The scouts around the fire looked at me as though I was from another planet. The campfire was the only sound, the logs crackling merrily, as the collected troops sat looking at me as I stood in the story circle. Even some of the scoutmasters looked a little rattled by the story, but, slowly, they started to clap. Scoutmaster Larry clapped the loudest, shaking his head as he approached. "Now I see why you wanted to go last. That would have been a hard story to top. I think we can agree which story wins this year's Jamboree Scary Story Contest." The applause picked up then and Davy slugged me in the arm as I sat back down. Can't believe you kept that to yourself all week. I thought Kevin was gonna pee his pants. Was not, Kevin said petulantly, though he looked a little pale, nonetheless. I smiled. Storytelling was something I was good at, and it was always nice to be recognized for my talents. I let my mind slip into the woods around us, hearing the call of the night birds and the whimper of the wind. Perhaps there was something like that out in the woods of the state park. Who could say what lurked in the deep pockets that surrounded area made for man? I felt myself shiver a little as the wind pushed a sound across my senses, a lonesome sound that sounded eerily like my name. My audience might not be the only ones having trouble sleeping tonight. Fourth story. Camping in the Ozarks. I love camping. I always have. Back where I grew up in Lousaville, Kentucky, you'd have to make a decent drive to find a good, secluded place to camp. That's the key to a successful trip, you know. You have to find a spot that's off on its own, away from the visitors center and all the first-time campers that tend to litter the site with cans and wrappers. I'm also an avid horror buff, and as such, I'm aware that secluded camping usually leads to slasher massacres or witch hauntings or goatmen attacks. At least in the stories and movies. Of course, they're just that, right? Stories and movies. But then, every one of those tales also stars a skeptic. I left Kentucky at the end of high school to attend college in Arkansas. You see, my mother had gone to school there, and they provide a generous scholarship of in-state tuition to children of graduates, even if they come from a couple of states away. Going to school in the Ozarks as a camping addict is fantastic. You wouldn't believe all the amazing spots there are to pitch a tent and enjoy nature at its purest. The Ozark National Forest, Devil's Den, Ouachita Park, and just dozens more. America's most obese state is an ironic haven for hikers and campers alike. Jared was kind of like our leader. He was the guy that always knew a spot, no matter where we were camping. He had this map, completely tattooed in markings and directions to all the most breathtaking areas. When we went to a new spot, or at least a spot that was new to him, he would mark it on the map in either green, if the spot was good, or red, if the spot was shitty. There were marks in other colors as well, different ones, but they are few and far between. He also marks the directions to each spot in highlighter. Jared looked the part too. A long-haired granola-style hippie with a sleeve of tats and a couple of earrings in each ear. But our walking stereotype was the best of the best when it came to camping, and his information was rarely secondhand. So when he burned up the group message running his mouth about a new spot his cousin found a couple hours south, we all cleared our schedules. I mean, how often were we all new to a location? We all met up at our buddy Kyle's house to pack the truck with supplies. Kyle's dad was pretty wealthy, and as a gift for raising his GPA to a 3.0, his father had bought him a brand new F-150 to hopefully keep his academic train rolling. My roommate and I showed up first, along with a cooler full of beer as a peace offering to Kyle for driving. We weren't technically legal, but Allie was only a month or two away, and she had a pretty killer fake, so we rationalized it morally, just as we had been doing for years. Austin was next, with his 5-6-person tent and a Sam's Club bulk of beef jerky, and Jared arrived last. Just so you know, we abide by general road trip rules in this truck, Kyle barked, sliding into the front seat and bringing the engine to life. So I don't want to hear a single complaint about my music choice. I snorted. New truck, new rules. I vote we make some amendments. Seriously, I'm not listening to fucking Trap the whole ride. Austin laughed. You morons have no appreciation for my tastes. Eventually, we decided on a rotation and pulled out of his driveway to head to Jared's cousin's spot, a place called Creekbend. Apparently, it wasn't well known enough to be on the entire damn internet. So we navigated their pre-2003 style, the old-fashioned way. The trip went quick, and after 3 hours of listening to Kyle's Trap and an assorted mix of alternative, we pulled off the main road and onto a dirt trail somewhere in southern Arkansas. We drove for another half hour or so before the trail abruptly ended. Oh, this is it all right. Jared chuckled with a smile. Let's grab the shit and get set up. I don't want to be fumbling with the tent in the dark. We followed Jared through the brush for a bit until we reached a gorgeous clearing. The mountains rose up all around us, and the mid-autumn trees set the world ablaze. The setup didn't take long, and soon we had the tent in perfect shape and a roaring fire. We had been shooting the shit for an hour or so, enjoying the sunset and roasting hot dogs, when Allie asked the question we had all been wondering. How'd your cousin even find this place? Allie asked, sipping her beer. Jared shrugged. He didn't, really. Max frequents this outdoors Y forum, and he said this guy PM'd him the site with pictures. He wanted to check it out first, but he was busy all weekend and knew we would be all for breaking it in. He took a drink of his own beer. So here we are. I think it's a pretty good spot. Sounds like the plot to a horror flick. Allie laughed. Random stranger gives coordinates to mystery camping location. Austin grinned. Oh, I dare some psychopath to come take us on. I'd love to see one try with 6 holes in his skull. Jared rolled his eyes. The guy was well known on the site. I thinks we're good. But nice to know you brought your gun. Austin laughed and reclined, flopping back to gaze at the stars. We decided to turn in a bit later, and while we all got ready for bed in the tent, Austin went to take a leak. When he came back, Allie held the zipper shut. Password. She chimed. Oh my God, are you in middle school? Just let me in. Austin groaned. Sorry, rules are rules. Okay. Is the password, you're all fucking idiots? Let me in, I'm freezing to death? He laughed. Allie giggled, and I threw a look at Jared and Kyle. We all thought they had a thing. No, that's not it. Try again. We heard Austin shuffle his feet. This is so stupid, he sighed. Please, come on in, Allie said with a 6th grade smirk. We all slept together when we camped in the fall or winter since it was usually pretty cold. Plus, it was easier to bring 1 tent rather than 5. It wasn't ever weird or uncomfortable, and Kyle usually generated so much heat it would be worth it even if it were. You know that feeling when you wake up and you're not sure why? Like you can't quite place why you woke up? It's as if you were asleep and then suddenly you just weren't? That's how it was for me, only accompanied with a sense of anxiety. I tossed in my sleeping bag for a moment before I noticed Austin crouched by the exit of the tent, holding the zipper shut. I screwed my vision against the darkness. Austin? Shoo, he hissed. I crawled over by him, and he looked at me, eyebrows raised. I think something is outside the tent. Maybe like a bear or something. It woke me up. Should we wake the others? I asked. Nah, He hesitated. I'm not worried. Did the sound wake you up too? I shook my head. Oh, well, it brushed up against the tent by my face, and that's what woke me. Thought maybe it had jarred you awake too. It sounded pretty big like Dash. He was interrupted by shuffling outside the tent. It did sound big. We looked at each other, and I kicked the others awake. What the fuck, guys? Kyle groaned. Jared shushed him, and we all listened again. More shuffling. Closer to the tent this time. Austin had his hand on his bag, ready to grab the gun if it was a bear, which seemed pretty unlikely for Arkansas. We had been camping for years, and we had never seen a bear. Austin squinted through the mesh. Guys, he whispered, I don't think it's a bear. As if in response, whatever was outside moved directly in front of the zipper. Its voice was choppy, garbled, and sounded just like Austin. Please, it stuttered. Please, 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 let me in. Holy shit, Jared whimpered. Austin, even in the dark, paled. More shuffling. I'm freezing. Please, please let me in. Let me in. Let me in. It rasped in Austin's voice. Who's out there? Austin barked, his own voice carrying all the fear he tried to hide. Who's out there? The thing replied. Who's in there? It mimicked Austin's tones for each word, making the sentences improperly meshed together. I said, who is out there? I have a gun. Austin's voice betrayed his terror even more this time. Kyle and I looked at each other, and Allie started to shake. We knew this wasn't a person. I had read all the stories, watched the movies. This wasn't human, whatever it was. Gun, gun, gun. It was like it was trying the word out, like a fucked up learning by phonics lesson. Let me in. I am freezing to death. Please, please, please. It moaned. The voice sounded more together this time, as it got the hang of Austin's voice. Kyle crawled forward and slammed both his hands on the mesh. No. Go away, he shouted. rapid shuffling in place. No, 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 no. It screamed in a butchered version of Kyle. No, please, Aletman. I'm freezing. Then, in the combined voice of dozens of people, I'm starving. Austin choked back a sob and ripped his gun from his pack. No. Jared hissed. Austin, stop, you don't dash. He fired it through the mesh, emptying the chamber. An otherworldly shriek pierced the stagnant air as the shuffling retreated. To the car. Now. Jared hissed. You shouldn't have done that, Austin, he added, unzipping and ducking out the flap. We all followed, blinding, stumbling after Jared, leaving all the stuff behind with whatever the hell was back there. I could hear it giving chase. It broke through the trail somewhere far behind us, awkward gait crashing through the trees and bush. We reached the car, clambering in, most of us crying. I turned in my seat as Kyle revved the engine to life, searching the tree lane. Its body was illuminated by the moon as it emerged from the brush. It must have been 9 feet tall, skin white as the light that revealed it. Its form was like a distorted human's, an unsettlingly long, thick torso with bony, unnaturally thin limbs protruding it. The legs were short, and I wondered just how it managed to stay standing on such weak-looking extremities. Its arms were equally thin, but long enough to drag along the ground as it walked. It had human-like hands, for elongated fingers, and a claw-like thumbnail in place of the digit. Its head was a darkness all its own. It was disproportionate for one. Its mouth took up almost the entire face, and was filled with teeth of various shapes and sizes. It had no nose, but its eyes glinted, all pupil, in the bright light of the moon. Just under its chin was a large sac, like a tumor or blister. It hung nearly to its shoulders and pulsed with every shriek and moan it gave. Kyle floored the pedal, and we peeled down the trail. It watched as we flew down the road, completely still, and gave one final scream as we disappeared from sight. We were silent the entire ride home. The only sound was Jared shaking hands as he pulled out the map and drew a purple X through Creekbend. I still camp sometimes, but only at the visitors' areas. The 5 of us haven't been out together since. I wonder about Jared's map sometimes. There were other markings on it, more than just red, green, and Creekbend's purple. Sometimes I wonder what else he's seen. He is a pretty avid camper. 5th story. There's something camping outside my window. About a year ago, I finally moved out of my parents' house. My childhood best friend and I started renting the bottom floor of a duplex from our old pastor, who gave us a really great deal. Basically, he keeps our rent lower if we take care of the yard. A small price to pay for cheaper rent. I don't mind the yard work. I don't even mind the travel nurses that rent upstairs. My problem is whatever has been camping outside my bedroom window at night. Now, I don't live in the greatest neighborhood. It's not some rundown part of the city, but it's definitely not the suburbs. We get sketchy people. Sometimes I get to play the fun game of, is it a firework or a gunshot? For that reason, I like to keep my curtains closed most of the time, especially at night. Usually I try to ignore any sounds that come from outside. I don't want to stick my nose in the business of whatever tweaker is dancing down the street. It's just safer to ignore it. However, a few weeks ago it started getting worse. It started off small. I heard someone walking down the alley. I remember it because they were really dragging their feet and it was just loud against the gravel. But I didn't think anything of it until the next night it happened again. But this time my light was on. I could hear them walking down the alley, stop for a moment, and start walking again. But their dragging footsteps were getting louder. They weren't in the alley anymore. They were on the side of my house. They had to walk past my roommate's window, which for whatever reason she always leaves the blinds open on. When I realized they were on the side of my house, I quickly turned my light off and sat completely still in the center of my bed. I didn't dare make a sound. They stopped outside my window, and it was quiet for a few minutes. I knew they were still there, but I didn't know what they were doing. Were they just staring at my window? I had no idea, but I was frozen with fear. I didn't even move when it started tapping. It was so soft at first, a very faint tap, 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 like they used the pad of their finger instead of the nail. I thought about texting 912, but what do you tell them? Hello. I live in an area populated with drug addicts and homeless, and now one of them is tapping on my window. It sounds ridiculous. So I just sat there, in terrified silence for a few minutes until it finally stopped tapping and dragged its feet away. I swear I sat there for an hour until I finally moved again. The next morning I told my roommate and she was freaked out just as much as I was. I mean, you have to walk past her window to get to mine, and you can see clear into her room. She said she would keep her blinds closed for a few days, just in case whoever had come that night came again, and sure enough they did. I made sure my light was off once the sun started to go down. I didn't want to draw any attention to my window, but eventually I heard the dragging footsteps and sat in silence, just hoping they would continue down the alleyway. But they didn't. Of course they didn't. They didn't even pause this time. They just continued past my roommate's window and stopped outside of mine. This time they used their nail, a sharp tap tap tap, a few seconds of silence, and then more tap tap taps this time. I texted 911. I told them my name, my address, and that there was someone harassing me, that this was the second time they had come to tap on my window. The dispatcher told me someone would be there soon to move them along. But by the time the cops arrived, the person was gone. This continued for another week before I sent a message to my landlord and told him I was going to buy a camera for the side of the house. He was understanding and suggested getting another camera for the front door, like a Ring doorbell or something. My roommate and I did just that, but we got an off-brand camera because it was cheaper but worked basically just as good. 2 more weeks. The tapping turned to knocking, and the knocking to whispering. The whispering turned to talking. But it was always incoherent. Every time I would text 911, and every time he would be gone when the cops showed up. I would always show the cops the footage, just so they knew I wasn't making it up. Now comes today, weeks after all this started. One of the officers agreed to stay and wait, to see if this person would come back. And you know what? He did. He did come back, his feet dragged along the gravel of the alley and concrete path that leads to the side of my house. And you know what I heard? I heard the officer tell the man to stop. He told the man to lower his weapon. He told the man to back away. And then I heard muffled screams. I looked at the camera footage and nearly screamed. The man's face was directly in front of the camera, as if he was watching me through the camera. He had wide, erratic eyes and a painfully large smile stretched across his face. He continued to stare into the camera, and then he started whispering, then he was talking, and then he started screaming. Eventually he left the camera and stood outside my window again, just screaming. He didn't even stop to take breaths, it just kept going. Until finally more cops showed up. I couldn't bring myself to watch it as they confronted him. I mean, he killed a cop. Of course they ended up putting him down. 6 shots they put into his chest. They took me to the station after that. They asked me some questions, asked for my camera footage, and went over previous conversations I had with 911. It all added up. Finally, they told me to go home and try to get some rest. That was a few hours ago. I'm home now. It's about 7 a.m. The sun is up. I'm in my room with my bedroom door locked. It's a force of habit. Any hope I might have had of getting any rest is gone now. I think my roommate is outside my door. I've tried calling her name, but she didn't answer. She's just tapping. A soft tap tap tap, like she's using the pad of her finger instead of her nail.